All right, in this video, we are going to discuss some very basic, but I think very important issues relating to John Locke's view on slavery. So first, Locke claims that slavery is unfit for rational men, right? And he thinks that this is true because God has created all men to be equal. Remember, he has this kind of egalitarian view of the way in which we exist in the state of nature, right? The way that God has designed us, having certain natural laws. All right, so in the case of slavery that comes from something like war, John Locke says that this is actually a kind of a continuation of that particular war, right? So when soldiers take certain individuals as slaves, that's just a way of not closing out the war. The war continues insofar as that person now owns those other soldiers in combat. Right, so this raises a very interesting question. Locke seems to, on the one hand, oppose slavery, yet on the other hand, there are reasons to think, both in Locke's own writing and some of the historical features and elements that we know about Locke, as well as in the United States, there's reasons to think that the views of Locke are being used to actually support slavery. And so why is that? That's just a long-standing question of how is it that someone like John Locke and Jefferson, the founding fathers of the Constitution, how is it that they could embrace the equality of all men, yet at the same time argue in support of slavery? That just seems straightforward, a kind of a contradiction, right? Well, Locke, it looks like, is not really opposed to slavery. In fact, you might think that Locke, his opposition and writing to slavery is very shallow. It's maybe metaphorical. So Locke argues that the reason why slavery is so wrong is because he ties it to the monarch, right? Ties it to the king. And remember, Locke is arguing against the divine right of the king or of a monarchy in general. And so he thinks that slavery is basically the same sort of political structure that you have with a king and his servants, or the obedient the people that he's ruling over, right? You have a kind of a master-slave structure or mentality involved here, right? And so he's not really arguing against slavery per se. Rather, his argument against slavery is an indirect argument against monarchy. And so you might wonder to what extent this was also true for people like Jefferson or the founding fathers in general. Now, that's an open question. I'm not trying to say there's a correct answer that we can just figure out right now, but I think that is an interesting question that you should pay attention to. So there are some reasons to think that, there's some very good reasons to think that Locke actually was in support of slavery. For instance, Locke had numerous financial ties to African slave trade with the Americas, specifically in Carolina, right? He actually sat on the council, governmental councils in Carolina to try to understand and figure out what was the best way to do the slave trade with Africa. And so it seems very strange that he would just simply, on the one hand, argue against the theoretical features of slavery, while at the same time, practically in his life, endorsing slavery, right? That just seems very odd, very strange. A more consistent interpretation of Locke, I would suggest, is that he wasn't against slavery in any real sense. Rather, he was using slavery metaphorically to argue against the monarchy, because he saw the structure in place between the king and the subjects as being basically the same as the master and the slave. And so when he argues that slavery is unfit for rational men, I think one way that we could interpret him there is to say that human beings, men, should not be ruled by a king, that it's unfit for rational men to be ruled by a king. And maybe that's another way that we can interpret the sort of the philosophical approach that the founding fathers took to slavery as well. In fact, you'll see in a few videos here in a minute that actually they wanted to keep the term slavery out of the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence. And so you might ask yourself, well, why was that? Well, because they were directing their arguments against the king, the monarchy, and so they did not want to confuse, perhaps, I'm suggesting this is an interpretation, they did not want to confuse one understanding of slavery with Locke's understanding, which is really directed at the monarchy. So with that, in mind, the next thing that we're going to turn to is Locke's view of property. How does Locke's view of property kind of fit into this larger structure of his limited view of government and liberalism in general?